Good afternoon, folks. Hope you're feeling all bright and breezy. Wish I'd gone to bed a bit earlier. So it feels a bit trivial to say that everyone can feel the tension in the country at the moment. But I think that what I can feel is, though it takes a lot of time in this country, the wheel of history is slowly turning. And there's a growing understanding amongst the English people themselves that the British state has its face set against them. And I think this was most starkly revealed in the recent decision about the Bell Hotel in Epping. Now, for anyone not aware, the Bell Hotel had been contracted by the government to house illegal Channel crossers who broke into our country, and there have been 2 illegals staying at this hotel who have been charged with sexual assault, multiple times, in fact. The first one is Mohammed Shawak, a 32-year-old Syrian national who was charged with 7 counts of assault, including a sexual assault, and Hadush Kibatu, a 41-year-old Ethiopian national who was charged with 3 sexual offences against a child. The presence of these predatory men within sight of a school naturally incensed the locals, and they've conducted a series of protests at the hotel. And this came to a head, and the local council applied for an injunction to remove the illegals and close the hotel. But it appears that this was accepted by the High Court, but appealed against by Yvette Cooper's Home Office, explicitly on the grounds that the cases were, quote, not equal, and to ask the court to allow them to preference the rights of the illegals over the people of Epping. And this was, of course, widely interpreted as the state, frankly, declaring that the rights of the illegals are superior to the rights of the locals and their right to not have their children molested. Concurrent to all of this has been the very widespread Raise the Colours campaign, which I'm sure you've all seen as you drove here, which has been English people all across the country putting up the St George's Cross and the Union Jack, in what I guess amounts to an act of defiance. And the reaction to this has actually been quite muted. It's been quite petty and very bureaucratic, because the government isn't entirely sure what it means nor what they ought to do about this. So they've kind of kicked it down to the local councils. You know, you go repaint the roundabouts if you like, take the flags down if you like. And so there have been a bit of a back and forth war with locals repainting the things, putting the flags back up. And all while this goes on, we still get immigration figures in it. And so the government's still legally importing about 1 million foreigners a year, which of course is just continuing to contribute to the ethnic displacement of the English in England with no end in sight. So I think this campaign, the Raise the Flags campaign, is quite significant. And I think the Eping Hotel decision is also very significant. What the flag campaign represents is the first act of an emerging nativist political conscience. And I think it's using the flag as a statement of resistance to the multiculti British state. The pressure is building, and I think that people are rapidly coming to the conclusion that if things carry on the way they've been going, we are looking at the death of England, and this will have been brought about by the British state itself. And so it's not uncommon now to hear dark mutterings about civil war and people expressing a desire for a new Cromwell. But of course, this doesn't really make that much sense. People aren't really sure what they mean when they say civil war. They just know that something must be done. Because by any traditional definition, it really just seems like it can't happen. There's a moral unity in the government, the state, and its ideological apparatuses. There isn't a party that's prepared to break away from the existing consensus, raise a banner and raise an army. So who exactly are we talking about being the opposite faction in it? And so maybe it's civil war against the Muslims is what people are thinking, but again, that's not actually very coherent, because, I mean, well, it wouldn't be a civil war by definition. It'd look more like an anti-colonial uprising. I think what people are actually trying to say when they say civil war is what they're trying to do is describe the general rift between the interests of the nation as a people and the interests of the state as an instrument of universal human rights. And I think more, it signifies the awareness that the English themselves have become, in effect, a stateless people and ought to try and regain some sovereignty. And moreover, I think that people are aware that the government's growing foreign plantations on our soil are getting away from their own control and from their own oversight. I mean, when was the last time you heard a politician talk about integration? That ship's clearly sailed. And occasionally, they'll try and fall back on the virtues of multiculturalism. But that's been admitted to be a failure more than a decade ago by Merkel and Cameron, and nobody wanted it anyway. And so the only avenue they've got left to flee down is a desperate appeal to the holy NHS and to invoke the mysticism of the GDP. But even then, the numbers are in, and these are against them. We've had millions of immigrants, we've got a flatlining economy, and the overall degradation of the country is just manifested all around us. Being in such a beautiful room, you might not come to believe it, but then when you go down the streets of Birmingham, I went to McDonald's for breakfast this morning, and I saw a bunch of foreign homeless people just sleeping against the side of the church. Wonderful. Everything is too expensive. Taxes are through the roof, services are decaying, and anyone with means is fleeing the country before the grasping hands of the state can reach into their wallets and redistribute their earnings to the most recent arrivals. When you look around, it's evident that the post-war liberal order has left England scarred, deformed, impoverished, and oppressed under the tyranny of human rights. Injustice is rampant across the land, and it seems to me that the time of the cosmopolitan welfare and warfare state, as Marcuse would describe it, is actually coming to a close. Because with the expansion of the scope and powers of the state, we've seen a withering of its own enforcement arms. The police and the intelligence services can henpeck the English community into submission on an individual and day-by-day basis. But the fundamental logic of people paying for their own replacement is untenable, and the state is eminently conscious of its own manpower problem. Moreover, it just doesn't make any sense that communities with so little in common would want to have a shared but uneven commitment to providing resources to one another. The whole issue is actually ridiculous when you think about it, and I think it's probably inevitably going to come to an end. And I think the flag protest is the beginning of this process. I think that actually, despite all of his many bad predictions, Francis Fukuyama is right to invoke Plato's tripartite soul to try and explain all of this, because he correctly identifies that liberalism does satisfy two parts of the rational soul, two parts of the soul, the rational and appetitive parts, because we were quite happy with how our country was if you go back 20 years, and it was quite prosperous, and everything seemed fairly reasonable. And these are the individualistic parts of the soul that are really yours to be concerned with. But the remaining third part is the Thymos, the spirited part, and that's not individualistic. That is the part of the soul that is explicitly social and concerned with society and your status in it. And from this communal part of your soul extends your sense of ownership over and belonging within the society. And so the respect for it and the condition of it that you can see around you and you can feel in yourself is key to your own sense of self and situatedness. It's the wellspring of national pride. And it's this area where liberalism can't do anything to help. In fact, it's actively destructive. And as things get worse, that spirited part of us rails against the indignities. And I think that's what's behind the flag protest. And already, there are left-wing activists and MPs raising the alarm, saying the flag protests are racist. You'll doubtless have seen Kehinde Andrews on Good Morning Britain saying as much, or you might have heard Labour MP for York Central, Rachel Mascal, saying the England flags threaten the breakdown of society, their society. And they're not entirely incorrect. The raising of the English flag is a declaration of war against the hegemony of multiculturalism. It's no different to raising a flag of any other, the raising of any other flag over any other given territory. It's a symbol of dominion that announces the source of the moral jurisdiction over the area. The raising of the flag of St. George is an unequivocal statement that England belongs to the English, and the British state has, through its actions in Epping, declared that it doesn't agree. So, what follows from this? Well, I think it's obviously hard to say, and what I'm going to suggest might happen could seem absolutely ludicrous now, but I think things are changing very, very quickly, and I think everyone can see that actually. And within only a few years, it could be that the things that seem currently preposterous will be increasingly plausible. And I want to be clear, I'm not advocating for anything. So many of this might, frankly, not be entirely what you'd like to hear, and it might end up sounding like quite a dark prediction, maybe. But like I said, it's not what I want to happen, but I think it is what might happen, or as a potential future. So I think the English won't become explicitly racist, at least for the most part. I think that what will happen is actually there will be a kind of new conception of politics that begins in the feeling of us and ours, a kind of new groupishness, which will carry undertones of ethnic demands that will underpin political action and agency. That means, honestly, it's going to look like Tommy Robinson's rallies, right? Now, I realize there are going to be people who don't like that. Like I said, I'm not here to tell you what I think you might want to hear. I think that's just what it's going to look like. And so there will be, it will be in some ways multiracial, but it will also have this kind of sentimental and moral demand for England and the English people contained at the bottom of it. So it should, hopefully, at least come out in our favour in that way. In the short term, it also seems that post-liberal politics will manifest as the politics of sectarianism. Already we're seeing videos of the English working class harassing and insulting Muslims, vandalising mosques, and we've seen retribution from the Muslim community. There was the firebomb attack on this one chap putting up a flag, and I think this feeling of otherness is going to continue to increase over time. I think the Muslim community is a thymotic community, deeply thymotic community. They're very concerned about the respect they believe their community to be merited, and they're very concerned about disrespect to their community, which is bloody ironic given the collective guilt that community carries in this country. But they're going to take this very poorly, and I think they already are taking this very poorly. Like I said, I really want to stress, I'm not endorsing what's happening. I just think that this is happening and will happen in the future. And so it seems increasingly likely that the general hostility will increase and the flags will become informal territorial boundaries, if this hasn't already happened. The state will attempt to stamp this down for the obvious reasons that they want eternal peace and quiet. But the moral authority of the government has already waned to the point where I think any intervention from them will just be counterproductive due to the inherent two-tier nature of their policing itself. They'll police the English, they won't police the Muslims, various injustices will happen, and rather than them both fairly being punished as they ought to be, one side will be punished, the English side, and the Muslim side will be asked to put the weapons back in the mosque before they go and beat them up. I think this might spiral into something quite bleak, and like I said, I hope it doesn't happen, but I think it's possible that it will, and I don't think it will be that far in the future that I'm talking about here. I mean, if the next election is in 2029, it could well be that this has happening before then. I think Farage will doubtless win the next election, but he is, of course, the last man of the old order and won't take any substantive actions to resolve any of the problems. I mean, has anyone actually seen him waving an England flag in all of this, right? Jenrick has, Lowe has, Farage is strangely silent. But deporting 600,000 illegals would be nice. However, that's not really the problem. The problem is that there are millions of people who have been allowed to live here against our will, and or everything else. All of the problems are just a symptom of the overpopulation of the country. Moreover, I think he will signal against the patriots. He will signal against the people putting up the flags, against the people who form his own core base. And this will be an attempt to ingratiate himself with not only the foreign communities, but the institutions themselves to try and smooth over resistance. And on top of this, you can add Farage's general incompetence. I don't expect, Alex pointed out, you need 130 people to form a proper government, and Farage has got 3 friends. It's ridiculous how isolated he is after 30 years in politics, and with such success that he has had, and such popularity. If he can't form a government, a competent government, which he won't, he'll be instead surrounded by buffoonish yes men who are incapable of tackling the real problems head on, and they'll get nothing done, and they may well make the problems worse, actually. But beyond this immediate sort of plot of time, there are too many unknown unknowns to make any substantive sort of day-to-day political predictions about what might happen. So we're just going to have to wait and let the chips fall where they may. But I think there will be general trends in the future that we could expect and may well come about. For example, I think that it's entirely possible what we're witnessing now is the emergence of something we can call the English vote. That is the political voice of the English community, similar to the Muslim vote, or the feminist vote, or the Indian vote, or whatever. And if that's true, it could have a size that renders it deafening, and also it could be quite radical in its demands. And so it's conceivable that within the next decade, we actually could see the emergence of a quite staunchly nativist party that actually enacts David Starkey's dream of a Great Repeal Act and rolls back all of the constitutional reforms of the Blair era, from Blair through the Conservatives up until now. And this would mean not only the end of the reign of human rights legislation, but I think also a return to a more traditional form of Anglo-morality, fairness as the cardinal virtue, work as validation, punishment as retribution. And what this signifies is the end of the universal individualist reign of liberalism, and a return to a more traditional form of politics where actually groups themselves are imbued with moral significance that goes way beyond the sort of ancillary parochial customs and whatever use they have to the liberal state. Genuinely a kind of like old school view of collective understanding of groups, which I think will actually dovetail with, I think what we are witnessing at the moment actually is the end of the era of mass immigration. It seems that it's, no matter what the claimed benefits of mass immigration are, and I think they're wrong about them, I think the facts prove that, I think morally people have just had enough, and there's only so many knives that you can have in the back before you start making demands that immigration is just stopped entirely. And I think genuinely, if there was if immigration was actually doing something good for the country, we should be able to measure it. So I think that will be demanded to be stopped entirely, and the funding for immigrant communities just from the state just turned off. And once that happens, I think that a change in attitude towards the immigrants will be felt by the immigrants themselves, and this will doubtless signal to them that it's time to leave. And I expect many of the foreign worker types or the Boris Wave nomads will simply self-deport, because they'll see Britain as not worth the time, effort, or risk to remain when they have other options available. But there will be other communities that won't, however. It could be that the sins of certain settler colonialist communities in England and their sins against the English community will not be forgiven. The only humane solution to the sectarianism may be mass repatriation. And it could be that this new national settlement is done in the same way as it was done in the early 20th century or upon decolonization. I think it could be founded in the ethnos itself. So it's possible that a radical right-wing government just commands, for example, the entire Pakistani community to leave, in much the same way the British were forced to leave India or the French were forced to leave Morocco. We will probably be less punitive about it, we'll probably pay them to leave, but I can see this being something that eventually happens after maybe 5-10 years of sectarian Northern Ireland style violence, where it's just, there is somewhere else that you could be, we have nowhere else, there's only one solution. This will not create homogeneously white England, though. There will still be millions of foreigners here. We'll have a legacy community of Fellaheen. The roadmen aren't going to voluntarily leave. They don't know anything other than Britain, actually. The scope of their horizon is incredibly narrow. And it's likely that they'll remain, frankly, as a reminder of the lunacy of the early 21st century. I don't think they'll become useful. They'll remain a blight on the country. But they will be touted by like the last remnants of the liberal order in like movies, and the BBC will probably still do drill rap pieces and things like that, but who knows, who knows. I mean, it could be that the community degenerates so thoroughly that the level of violence that it commits against itself, as well as other people, becomes just something completely untenable. And in a post-liberal order of politics, the question of rights is actually secondary to the question of what is right. And so it could be that a radical right-wing government says, no, every single one of you has lost your freedom now, and we are going to put you in a different, each individual one in a different town around the country or something. I don't know. Again, who knows what the actual solutions could be. But effective state action may actually be taken from a non-liberal government. I suspect that we will, as well, in all likelihood, see the population growth of Britain stall from these dramatic changes. I mean, that would be the point of them, actually. But this will doubtless affect the welfare and pension pyramid schemes of the 20th century, which I think we can agree are already untenable, and if something can't last forever, it won't. So at some point, these will simply be unfundable, and they'll fail due to a lack of funding. And therefore, I think it is probable at some point to have some other kind of dispensation that will be established. Put bluntly, what it will amount to is a complete reimagining of in what the good life actually consists, as juxtaposed against the 20th century ideal of atomic liberal democracy. The concept of liberating people from their unchosen obligations will likely seem increasingly ridiculous and even evil. Like, the idea of an old folks' care home is actually a really, really callous and cruel thing done by selfish and lazy working people who are like, no, I don't feel the need to look after my own parents. I'm just going to pay some Africans to do it for me. That is going to seem like a horrific thing in a post-liberal paradigm. Honestly, it would be genuinely, I'm sure there are countries around the world at the moment who look at us as if we're monstrous for things like this. The very nature of the welfare state and the pension system is to offload the obligations that families and local communities would otherwise carry to the state. And this is the ideological root of it. It is that nobody ought to be a burden to anyone else, but nobody ought to be burdened by anyone else. So that the young and healthy could essentially be free of that which in the rest of the world is simply taken for granted. That the young take care of the old, and that's why you have your own children. So they will be there for you when you are old to take care of you. Because at the moment, the state is actually intercepting this traditional cycle of life. And so it's no wonder people are choosing not to have their own families. We can complain about the birth rates all day, every day. We can complain about, why aren't men and women getting married? Why are women using birth control to prevent themselves getting pregnant? Well, ultimately, it's because they don't feel that they need to do this. If this was a pressing need, they would absolutely do it. And luckily for us, we can't afford a welfare state forever. We can't afford the pensions. So you are going to need it. So if you're sort of my age or younger, have some expectations of needing someone younger than you who loves you and wants to take care of you, because you're going to be on your own otherwise. And so in such circumstances, what we'll probably end up seeing, and again, this could be quite a long time in the future, but I think we could see the forced return to sort of self-reliance of local communities. But what that will mean is we will have to personally change our expectations in life. Like, the boomers thought they were never going to be put upon by anyone around them. That was their entire worldview, is to liberate themselves from the unchosen obligations of their own families. I mean, I can't even imagine letting my kids go out for all day, every day, just to get out of the house. Like, I like being around my kids. I want to see them. But the boomers had this, luckily for us, we had a safe country, but the boomers have a completely opposite action. But anyway, yeah, so if we can't afford the welfare state or infinite pensions, we're going to have to find some other way of helping those people who need it. There are going to be people who don't have families, who don't have support systems, and we'll probably end up seeing a return to like Victorian-style charities or some new format of like local parish churches helping the needy, whoever it is. But the point being, the 20th century expectations, the morality of the 20th century, the telos of a human life throughout the 20th century that was kind of hammered into us unthinkingly, that we can actually be as maximally free as possible, and I can just enjoy all my wealth and then go on cruises. No, that's going to end. And so the expectations of what we should get out of life have got to change. The liberal ideal is going to die, and Britain will basically just become a normal country again. So, as I hope I've made clear, this is all wildly speculative, and I'm speaking of broad trends that will doubtless stretch far into the future, and it's entirely possible that contingent events that couldn't be predicted in advance will prevent any of these things, or maybe all of these things, from happening. or that something entirely unpredictable happens instead and changes the course of things. But at least there is one thing I think we can be sure of, and that is that the old order is passing, and that something new is definitely coming into existence. And I do hope that it can be done as peacefully and civilly as possible. Thank you.